and Hannah sitting on a stone. I just want to check, Chris, was there anything in chat or anything that people wanted to ask right now? What a moment of clarity. I see, yeah, from Chris, yeah. All right, so we will.
Michael, I don't have any questions, but I will venture to say that everyone is fascinated right now.
Okay, well, I'm sure I'll get plenty of
feedback.
I am. I'm sure I'll get plenty of feedback here in a sec. So yeah. So taking notes, and we don't have a ton more to cover here in terms of the parts that I wanted to include today. So we're moving through very well. All right. So again, forgive me for my challenges with this system. So everybody sees relationship boundaries now.
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So this is about, and Lewin was very interested and impressed with the differences between the United States and Germany. And so, again, he thought of how to graph it, how to understand it, and then how to sort of put it in motion and put it into a dynamic so that we can understand, potentially predict, and then influence. And so the U type stands for USA, or United States type, and the G type is the German type. And again, there's some people on the call here that can tell us if this is still true, whatever we're up to now, 100 plus years later, whatever it is. So the idea was that there was a personality structure and a level of privacy. See, he was very interested in what he called social distance. So there's physical distance, there's also social distance. Sort of a classic example of social distance is somebody you might sit next to in a movie versus somebody you'd want to have come to dinner at your home. And so this is this idea of social distance. I'm sorry, is there a question? Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought I heard.
Just a little background noise. I muted.
No problem. That's great. And so you notice here that the G type has this thick barrier, and the hash starts with what he would call private region. So what is the socially public region? What is socially private? And so in the German type, region 1 is the very more formal kind of region. This is the proper, people are Mr. and Mrs. And then there's various levels of more and more private or intimate going all the way to number 5. Whereas in the United States, he felt you could very quickly get through some of these more, what would be more private in Germany, but then you had a much thicker barrier to really get to know someone and achieve what we might today call intimacy or full openness. And then later he takes these same ideas and puts them into a team approach where he talks about we-ness, the W-E-ness, or belongingness, which we might now call teamwork or something. And so he would notice that in the press, in the newspapers in the United States, whenever they would report about something, some event, some social event, they would tell what people were wearing. They would talk about what food was served. They might mention the place settings. None of this would ever be in any German press or documentation at the time. This would all be considered much too private or much too intimate. And I noticed this, I used this not too long ago to make a very long story short, some colleagues from Australia who I think have an interesting, what's the relationship boundary system in Australia. They came to the US for business. They played golf, they went to dinner, they went for drinks. They had all this time with these people in a certain company in Silicon Valley, and they talked business as well. They did all this stuff. People said, this is wonderful. The Australians went home thinking they got the work. They get back, and they get a very cold brush off from the US. Thanks a lot for your visit. We're going another way. They thought they had gotten through that barrier. They thought that the Americans and Australians had that same relationship boundary type, but in fact they didn't. And so they had not reached that kind of closeness. Again, this is from Resolving Social Conflicts. The big, this is the old version. There's a much newer version that combines a couple of things. So if you're going to get one, this is the one to get. This is, again, from 1940 or 38 or so. Okay, thank you for your patience there. So again, he started to say, okay, as they connect, as these different types of people and personalities are together, how can this impact the relationship? And so what he said with this chart is essentially it shows how it's possible to have a close relationship without really being a real friend. I like to say this is Kurt Lewin predicting Facebook 70 years before it happened. What is a friend? What is a relationship? Okay, so again, let's get a little bit more complicated now. We're going to apply this to much more serious subjects, but this is the idea of conflict in marriage. So again, the idea of the group. So first of all, the husband and wife, or the W and H here, they're a group. They're a group of two, called the marriage group. Then the marriage group is actually a part of a group called the family group. And then the family group is actually part of a group called the community group. And then you can see that there's this membership and overlapping groups. So now we add what he would call the professional club, the luncheon club, the political party, are all the various groups. And they all have their own set of dynamics. They all have their set of barriers, goals, valences, a valence or direction towards a goal. And so you can start to understand the sources of conflict in anything, and in this case in marriage, through these overlapping groups. When we talk about Gestalt psychology and Gestalt, the idea is not just the sum is bigger than the parts. The idea is actually the sum is different from the parts. And I use this again today because while I certainly understand and believe in things like Myers-Briggs, and there's a lot of value to DISC or colors or Enneagram or a million ways we want to type a personality, what Lewin says and what I say is that I'm not always an I or a T or an F or a D or a yellow. It depends. Depends on what group I'm in, what relationship I'm in. So Chris and I have a relationship. So Lewin says there's a thing called Papanek Leah, called Chris Michael. That's a single thing, and it has its own dynamic. It has its own type, if you will. That's why you'll find yourself in some of your relationships, you're very open, and some relationships you feel tight. When you're in one company or one group, or you're in your leadership meeting, there's one dynamic. When you're in a meeting with your own team, there's a different field and a different dynamic. And so to me, this is a much more helpful idea. It's nice to know kind of my type, if you will, but my type is dynamic and changes by situation. And by the way, most of the people that work with those individual types know this too. And I'm not imagining they don't know this or don't understand this, but that's the idea. The actions are based on the personality, the goal, and the negative and positive variances or barriers. And he called this a person's life space. And he felt you could map the life space. And behavior, just like when he was a soldier on the front, one's behavior is based on the person's own perception of their life space, which is subjective and not fact, and is truth as they see and feel it. And again, I think we don't have to look very far in our world today to see this happening. And so basically, people take actions to try to change their life space. It either does or doesn't. And then the next action is taken. And he said, it's much better. Experience alone doesn't really teach us anything. What we have to do is use that experience with a theory. We have to have a theory or an idea that we go into. We take actions as a way of testing. Then based on those actions, we evaluate our theory and repeat this process. Again, what we call action learning now. And frankly, what a lot of people just call agile programming. It's the same essential concept that says don't sit around and wonder, if women are envious of men, for some reason. Let's actually test things. Let's put this into action. He was one of the first people to say, these people that we're working with, they're not the subjects of our experiments. They're not even the patient. They're the client. And that what we do is only as good as how much we help them. And our theories are only as good as the practical application. Again, that was a little different from people at the time. So we'll go a little deeper into this idea of the marriage group. So now what he's done is again, people may have different social distances, as we said. And again, when you think of Jews, the Holocaust, when you think of ghettos, obviously social distance, intimacy, free movement become very, very important. And so you see he's mapped out tension in situation, frustration of the narrow space of free movement, in this case of the husband, and that some regions are more or less accessible. And again, we're going to go kind of quickly through this. But again, he says at the bottom, indeed, marriage means the willingness to share the activities and situations which otherwise might be kept more strictly private. So here, again, I show this one mostly for fun. This is his mapping of the life space of a husband. He's a very happily married fellow. But here you've got the life space, and it indicates the regions more or less influenced by the wife. You see the only areas that he says are essentially free are OF, which is the office, and GO, which is golf. By the way, Lewin didn't play golf. But when we think about polarization, a lot of this has to do with where is it free, where is it not. Another example of how he would use this kind of graphic mapping to try to create a scientific approach is he's comparing in this slide the bachelor to the married man, and what barriers are passable for the bachelor, what barriers are passable for the married man to get towards their goal. And again, the size and direction of the arrow indicates its strength. This one's a little more complicated, but if you take a moment, you can figure out, you see the arrows here, the overlapping spaces. And in this case, SE, there kind of in the middle bottom is sex life. And F with the script L is family life. You see the wife, you see the husband, you see activities outside of family life for the wife, activities outside of family life for the husband. And so the idea is conflict is when opposing forces are generally equal. If they're not equal, then one force will overwhelm the other and there's no more conflict. Somebody won, somebody lost, conflict over. But conflict is when you have these forces. And so when we're trying to change the system, it's often an organization, a business, whatever, we want to look at this and understand, well, what are the forces that are giving us the exact, you may have heard that saying, every system is perfectly designed to get what people really want. In other words, even if we're unhappy with the system, there must be something going on that is encouraging the behavior. Again, the system, the field, the culture, the values, all of this, again, whether it's in a concentration camp or anywhere, these are the forces that are at play. And so manipulation of those forces is ultimately how we're going to get something to change. So what he talked about was psychological, I'll never say the word right, satiation or satiation, I'm not saying it right. He called this hunger in the text that's around this. And people are trying to get their needs met. Now, a more kind of dramatic example of this is a map of the Jewish ghetto in Berlin. So the boundaries of the ghetto impose strict limitation for the bodily locomotion. So there's psychological freedom, there's bodily freedom, and this restriction physically led to social restriction or limited their social locomotion. So you see the Jews really only supposed to go from this side to this side. And so they were all kinds of social areas that were not open to Jews. There were jobs they weren't allowed to have. And so this obviously impacted relationships. And so you can see how you can apply this kind of mapping. And Lewin said that a lack of free life space or free locomotion leads to restless behavior, leads to attacks on barriers or symbols of barriers, leads to low productivity, fear, frustration, and conflict. Whereas a sense of belongingness, as he put it, increases security, increases resilience. I think this belongingness is what we call empowerment now. This sense of agency, that I have the ability to influence my life and my world, that my actions will change the field. And so people, when given this, will tend to be much more collaborative and be able to handle innovation, rapid change, and so forth. So just a couple more things we're going to talk about, and then we'll open up the rest of the time. So just take a moment to talk about the famous study that was done at University of Iowa. So again, the idea of doing any kind of a study group and research, control groups, measurement, this was all pretty out there to deal with things like leadership and group dynamics. So they came up with three styles: autocratic. They call them autocratic, laissez-faire, and democratic. Today, we'd probably call it command and control. We'd call it hands-off, and we might call it facilitative or collaborative leadership or servant leadership. And so, again, he liked working with children, so he had 11-year-old boys that were formed in these groups, and they were to make papier-mâché masks. That was the task. And then they had 3 different leadership types. You've got all the graduate students and such, and so they're trying very carefully to control. In other words, if they ask one of you, please be autocratic, well, what do you mean by autocratic? And we don't want to have it all, we don't want the outcome of the research to depend on any individual. So we actually have to come up with measurable and observable actions and indicators of autocratic leadership and laissez-faire leadership and democratic leadership. What do they do? Then we would observe the behavior of the boys as they would make papier-mâché. So the autocratic leader would basically tell the first step, go tear some paper. They don't know what the next step is. They don't know why they're tearing paper. Go tear some paper, come back. And they wouldn't acknowledge progress. They wouldn't give any positive feedback. The laissez-faire leader would kind of stand there and start doing stuff. And the kids would kind of have to figure out, oh, I guess this is what we're doing. And they would kind of work on their own. And then the democratic leadership would explain the steps and help people understand the goal and then demonstrate good positive feedback. And then they measured all the outcomes and the behaviors. And again, the idea was that leaders create what Lewin called the social climate, or what today we would call the culture of an organization. The autocratic leader, the results were that the group was always less productive. The least productive was the laissez-faire group. But the autocratic group was less productive, and they also would test what would happen when the group left. I like to say to leaders today, you know what, go on vacation, let me observe your team, then I'll tell you what kind of leader you are. Right? We don't know what kind of leader you are when you're there. We actually know what kind of leader you are when you leave, because then all that's left is the field you've created. Well, under the autocratic field, the boys would start stealing stuff from each other, complaining, interacting, yelling at each other, being mean to each other. Laissez-faire group would sort of just, continue to disintegrate usually. The democratic group would help each other. They'd give each other positive feedback when the leader wasn't there. And so this is still used today. Now, one thing I'll warn you is often they'll take these 3 names. If you go to Google and search for Lewin leadership styles, you'll see all kinds of graphic with 3 circles, and they'll make them overlap. And in the center, they'll say is the ideal leader. This is completely incorrect based on what Lewin has said. But I mean, I was at a high-tech company just the other day, and they were talking about leadership styles. They talked about hands-on and command and control and so forth. So people are still kind of using this approach. And again, the autocratic leader led mostly with sentiment. He or she would require obedience. And what Lewin felt is that blind obedience was the abandoning of reason and independent thought. But if reason is to prevail, he said, then the best ideas can come from anyone. It's not who says it, it's what they say. So the next time you're in a brainstorming meeting, you're doing this. You're following Lewin's idea. Because brainstorming, as you know, is kind of claimed, there's an invention story about brainstorming where they talk about advertising in the 1960s. In those days, and maybe today, I don't know, you have very autocratic, hierarchical type environments where the lead advertising executive is the only one who should have a creative idea. Brainstorming says the idea can come from anybody. And so this was this essential belief in humanity, this essential democratic belief. And again, he knew that if the idea could come from anyone, then the implementation was much more likely to be supported. So he thought that all this was linked to oppression of minority groups, and that any too much reliance on the leader was very risky. So I'm just going to take a second to read you a passage from Resolving Social Conflict, Time, Perspective, and Morale. And this is a passage you see a little highlighting, a little private note here and here. This is my mother's notations. It is not chance that the fight against reason and the replacement of reason by sentiment has been one of the unfailing symptoms of politically reactionary movements through the centuries. To recognize reason socially means that sound argument counts no matter who brings it forth. It means recognizing the basic equality of men, as he put it then. In an autocracy, only the leader needs to be correctly informed. In a democracy, popular determination of policy can only work if the people who will participate are realistically aware of the actual situation. In other words, the emphasis on truth, the readiness to let people know about difficult situations and failures, does not spring merely from an abstract love of truth, but is rather a political necessity. A far more stable ground for morale is the belief in the ability of any leader individually, is the belief in truth itself. Important words. And I'm gonna end here and not cover these. Many of these you may have seen before. And then here is where I've kind of have a little bit of a list of a lot of the ideas that we use today, the idea of feedback, or what he called processing. When somebody says, let's process something, they're using actually a Lewinian term to learn from it. Again, the idea that there are no bad apples, I'll just highlight that one quickly. A lot of times when we're in trouble in an organization, we look at the person. We go, this person's a bad person. They're inappropriate for the job. They're a bad apple. The old saying, don't let a bad apple spoil the whole barrel. Well, Lewin would say the barrel's the problem, not the apple. It's the system you've got this protein. Of course an apple's going to rot. It's in a dark barrel, right? So yes, sometimes we have to change the people, but the leaders that change the system usually have a much bigger impact. So let's go to any questions or comments.
Hi, Michael, thank you so much. Everybody, just a quick announcement. Feel free to come off of mute, and if you want to be on video, that's great. Also, if I don't have your email address yet, I need your first, last name, and your email address so that I can communicate and follow up with the presentation materials and recording. So, Michael, would you like to come off of sharing so you can, do you need the sharing still, or?
Not unless they want something. But let's go to, I realize I went a little past what I wanted to go. I can go past the hour if others want to, but let's just go ahead with the questions.
Yep, so we can open it up for questions if anyone wants to just jump in. I think there was one or two questions in the chat feature. And by the way, if you're giving me, yes, thank you for everybody that's giving me your contact information. Appreciate it.
Have you seen social distance correlating with one taking initiative versus waiting to be invited to participate? That's a great question. I'm not immediately, have you seen social distance correlating with one's taking initiative?
So Michael, I asked that question because as you were talking about the personality distance, and I work in an international company with a lot of Swiss and German colleagues and the US side. And on our side, Canada and the US, we we seem okay taking initiative and jumping in, and then on the other side, even when we jump in, there's hesitation of even getting started. And as you were talking about that, it kind of was a light bulb in the sense that it's more of relating to the personality, not so much the willingness or not. So I just was curious to see if there's any work that's been done around initiative taking and this context. So
that's great. Yeah, and I don't know that there's any kind of formal work in terms of that exact connection, but Lewin would certainly say that he would agree with you that it's really a lot of it is about the social type of the personality type. One of the things I've seen, I've done a lot of work with outsourcing and trying to people in India trying to work with people in the U.S. And I remember I would go to the people in the U.S. and they say, these people will promise they'll do something, but then they don't do it.
Yeah.
I go to the people in India and they say, these people in America won't take no for an answer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I think this is a similar thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and we experience that too when we work with Asia, right?
So the answer that I would have for them is always we have to get together in person, at least in the beginning. And I often said, symbolic things also matter. What time is the meeting? Is it convenient for the U.S. people only? Or is it do we sometimes will meet at 3 a.m. so that it's not 3 a.m. for them? Right. So I think that's important. I also want to address a couple of the comments here about this idea of blaming the system, somehow absolving the individual. So yeah, that would be taking this idea a little too far. So remember, behavior is a function of the individual and their environment. So the individual is absolutely still in the formula of what Lewin is saying. And I remember discussing this with my mother a lot, and sometimes she would have to remind me. So I think some of that may have come across in the way of talking about it. I still believe that when we look at these phenomena, the leader and the field and the culture do tend to overwhelm the individual, but individuals still have a choice of how they react. And if nobody's holding a gun to your head, which is true most of the time now, one can just not be in that system. You can quit that job. You can try to change it. You can have your own morals and values that you're following. So it's never an attempt to say, oh, the individual has no role. The idea is that it's not only about the individual. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you clarified that, Michael. Other questions? You don't have to put it in chat, everybody. You can just jump in with your voice. There's Andrew.
Hi, something I'd like to just throw in. What we were just talking about how people from different cultural backgrounds operate. And there was some great work done by Geert Hofstadter in his book, Culture and Organizations.
Yes.
That really kind of points to that stuff. So that's a good resource to go to. What I was thinking about when I put in the comment about how often people's subtler underlying motive is to actually make sure that they can place blame for unacceptable outcomes on the system rather than on themselves is very closely related to complexity theory and like complex adaptive systems where the system affects the parts and their relationships and vice versa. So you're absolutely right, Michael, that these things interact. And this is something I see all the time in my work, is people actually not being conscious of their subtler underlying concerns, which are typically things like avoiding responsibility, looking good, avoiding looking bad. Because after all, we're all still, bless us, primates, right?
Well, I think what we want is we don't want unfair blame.
Right.
We don't want to be blamed for something that we had no power over, right? So there's a relationship between accountability, responsibility, and authority.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is very important to see, that Those are levers we can pull, and we can see how aligned or out of alignment those things are. Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Isn't that a good way of thinking about this whole field? It's about distinguishing all of the knobs and dials and levers that we can actually bring to people's attention so they can start to manage all of this stuff themselves. Brilliant.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
That's right. So it's a combination of the personal responsibility and the system.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think there's a certain convenience. Well, this salesperson isn't selling the product we want, so or enough of it. So let's replace them with a different salesperson. Well, what about the product, the price, the competition, the way they sell, the way they're incented, the way they're managed? You know, because if you find yourself again with these patterns repeating, then maybe the pattern is in the system, not in the individual. But yeah.
And that's true the other way around. That if the individual notices that everywhere they work, they're surrounded by jerks, I wonder what the common factor is in all of those situations.
That's right.
Right.
I see a question from Adrian. Did Lewin ever do any research on teams trying to achieve goals in contrast to the individual, like the video of the child with a rock with significant differences? Yes, absolutely. So a whole bunch of things, again, that I didn't really get a chance to talk about. But he worked a lot with this concept of teams and what would lead to the more what defines a team and how does a team develop? What are the stages they have to go through? You know, many of us know the Will Schutz model of inclusion, control, openness. Many people obviously know the Tuckman model, which rhymes: norming, forming, storming, performing. Lewin, I think, was very interested in understanding about the alignment of goals, the alignment of barriers. And so what is a team and what is the role of the team leader? Was very much was about. So even though that little video I showed you was about an individual, he was much more focused on groups and how to move and change groups. And in those short 13 years that he was in the U.S., obviously there was all kinds of prejudice. Certainly there was prejudice against Jews. My mother, as a little girl with Kurt as her dad, would find anti-Semitic things written on her locker at her little grade school. So Lewin worked with groups of blacks and whites trying to deal with racial issues. He worked with recent immigrants and other majority. So he did a lot of work with that. And he did not find significant differences, again, but you have to acknowledge, or he would want us to acknowledge, if there's 10 people on a team, there's an 11th entity in the room, right? That was his a big finding, is this idea of the group identity. And then if you were a member of a team, if you were a member of a group, let's say you're a member of a minority, he would actually did a lot of work on how much in the center of that group did you want to be, and how some people wanted to try to exclude themselves from the group. There's a long article, and I think the title is The Self-Hatred of the Jew. And so he was interested in why would somebody do that? And you know, the majority makes you be in this group. And so he wasn't studying teams maybe in the exact way they're talking, but a lot of that work was done in what he called the industrial. So he was kind of a founder also of industrial psychology, where it related to teams. And so there's a lot of good information about teams there. So cool question.
Yeah,
we have time for maybe one more. And again, or just any comments or thoughts that you'd like to share.
Hi, this is Catherine. And I apologize, there's probably a lot of background noise behind me, but I think you mentioned something earlier about the minority groups and how they can influence the greater the systems around them. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm an African American woman, so of course this is of great interest to me. So I'm curious to learn more or hear more.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the essential questions, and there's sort of this famous letter that he wrote to Kohler, that same professor that my mother's turned out to have as a professor at Swarthmore, was a good friend of Lewin, and he was struggling with, in a way, sort of what he saw as two ways for the minority to act. One way was basically following the rules, if you will, accepting the certain aspects of the oppression in order to build relationships with the oppressor. So, one might think about sort of, a movement among African Americans to say, you know what, let's have our own banks, our own businesses, our own neighborhoods. Fine, let's not try to change anybody. We're going to have our own thing, and we're just going to make that as good as we can. And we'll live in this system. And when we can, we'll show to people that we're not bad people. But then there's another side of it that says a lot of people can never be won over. And how strict are those rules? And there is a point where he said, you must rebel. The title of the letter is Everything in Me Screams to Rebel. And when you think about that Prussian model that we talked about a little before, the act of rebelling, what is it Kafka or whatever says something, in the land of oppression, telling the truth is a radical act. I haven't got that quote quite right. So that was his tension, and he was a firm believer that said there's a point where you have to fight. For example, if the oppressor is trying to wipe you out. So those were some of his thoughts about how the minority would interact. Is that anything of what you were thinking about?
Yes, I mean, it's something that, I can definitely relate to, right? And, I used to work in finance for many, many years, and that is, an area that's full of, white men. So, it's how do I navigate this? What do I want to do? How do I want to, kind of work within that system? And a lot of it is kind of playing by the rules, right? Trying to play
that's right.
So I can fit in versus, that, but I, definitely had some internal struggles about how do this guy's an ass or.
Yeah. And there's a point, right? That's what Lewin would say. There's a point where maybe it is better to try to potentially create sacrifice to yourself, which is certainly true for Lewin and his family. It's time to rebel. A phrase I use today that's related to this in my own coaching, and I have actually a number of women leaders that I'm coaching, and one of the phrases we sometimes use is, I'm not against anyone, but I am for myself. So in those systems, maybe you're not have to be against, but no one will be for you but you. And so there are times when you have to be for yourself, and then let the system do what it does.
Absolutely. I like that. I like that phrase a lot.
Yeah. So that's a Lewinian idea that says, I don't have to be against anyone, but I must be for myself, because no one else will do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So Michael, do we have any other questions? Anybody? Michael, you probably need a sip of water or a cup of coffee or something, but just, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I see Catherine's phone is active here. Catherine, is that Catherine Bates? I think so. Anyway.
I'm just going to show you a couple of things.
Ooh, okay, good.
So this huge thing is Kurt Lewin's diploma. It's the real one. It's the actual diploma from Germany. And then this is just a little fun thing that I wanted to show. Again, these are big. They don't show well on video. I should take a picture of them maybe and send it out. This is Kurt Lewin visiting the Grand Canyon with Margaret Mead and her husband. So there's Lewin. You see him in his formal jacket and tie and vest. And there's Margaret Mead's husband. There's Margaret Mead. And there's the cowboy guide. And I just think, what a fun photo from September.
Yeah.
32.
Yeah.
Lewin met Einstein once. There's a fun story about Lewin meeting Albert Einstein.
We would. I think we've got a couple of requests for copies of those pictures.
Yeah, I'll try to. I'll
Yeah.
take a photo with my phone, and
Yeah.
then I'll.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you so much. And then you'll send out your materials. You can send it to. You can put it in our Dropbox, and everybody. I'll be communicating, sending materials, sending the recording. I just want to make sure that I have everybody's email address, first and last name and email address. So thank you so much. Michael, any final comments?
Again, the important thing for me is sort of mentioning Einstein, I think he talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. And so I'm humbled and honored to have any relationship with Kurt Lewin and to be standing on his shoulders as we do what we do. But especially for people that are newer to OD, what we might call the next generation, I think that it's really important that they realize, it's not sort of just about employee retention or whatever it might be about. There's a theory of the world here. There's a point of view about what makes a better world. And those of us that are in OD and leadership development and organizational change are part of a legacy of freedom, of peace, of building a better world. And that I just really hope that, when you're sitting in some meeting and it's not all going great, that you kind of remember what you're a part of and that it helps inspire you as it does me.
Yes. Any final comments from those of you who are still with us on the phone and audio? Feel free to jump on and whatever you'd like to say briefly. We can wrap up here shortly. Yes, Catherine, the recording's going to be available. Yes, the recording. I'll render that out. It might be a big file, but I'm going to set up a Dropbox folder and have everybody have access to that.
And I will say that, I love to discuss all this, as you can obviously tell. There's a lot that, I sometimes talk about that, we didn't want to take the time today. So I'd be more than open to emails, phone calls, or any other kind of follow-up that if anybody's interested to do. I'd be more than happy to do that as our schedules allow.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you especially for convening us. I just can't say how much I appreciate it, Chris. A great opportunity. Yeah.
Well, we're grateful to you. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody that's still on the call. And I know that a few folks have had to drop off already, but that's okay. We'll all be in touch. We will, after I send out a message, have the ability to all get in touch with each other. So I think this is also a networking opportunity for us to continue our friendship, our dialogue. So thanks again, and have a wonderful weekend to everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.